Initiating development with the king's knight. This opening aims for flexibility, maintaining options for pawn structures and queen's bishop development. Immediately seizing central real estate. d5 challenges white's knight and opens diagonals for black's pieces. Crafting a flexible fianchetto setup, aiming for long-term control of the light squares and a harmonious development. Developing knight into the center opens lines and prepares castling. Developing the bishop to g2 fianchetto completes white's kingside pawn structure and readies the bishop for long-range influence across the diagonal. Preparing a fianchetto for the bishop, this move subtly shapes the pawn structure and aims to control the long diagonal. Securing the monarch with prompt castling prepares for unified piece development and potential central action. The bishop elegantly mirrors white's fianchetto, preparing to contest the long diagonal for queenside influence. Challenging black's central pawn foothold with immediate dynamism, aiming to unravel the queenside. Solidifying the pawn chain, black fortifies the center, preparing to contest central control and potentially expand on the queenside. Unleashing the queen to b3 aggressively pressures black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on c6 and d5 by creating a two-pronged assault that could force concessions or create tactical opportunities. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, allowing subsequent pieces to develop with greater freedom and confidence. Solidifying the central pawn structure, white aims to exploit the lingering weakness on black's queenside, while simultaneously preparing a pawn advance to gain more breathing room and restrict black's minor pieces. Challenging the center's dominion, this queen redeployment introduces immediate complications by probing the queenside and threatening a queenside pawn majority push, forcing white to meticulously defend against potential weaknesses. Asserting central presence, white reinforces the d4 pawn, a crucial anchor in the unfolding queenside pawn storm black intends. This quiet development subtly pressures the c6 pawn, potentially creating future targets and disrupting black's planned queenside expansion. The knight now eyes the e4 square, hinting at a possible repositioning to control more vital squares. Shifting the rook to the d-file might seem passive, but it's a subtle preparation to contest that crucial central column, potentially supporting a pawn break or preparing for future exchanges. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside, Na aggressively challenges black's queenside structure, aiming to disrupt coordination and potentially gain space for white's pieces. This gambit of the knight promises a dynamic struggle where black must carefully defend against immediate threats while considering the long-term positional concessions. Trading off the queen here immediately simplifies the position and releases pressure on white's queenside, allowing black to consolidate their central pawn chain without the immediate threat of the queen's influence. Opening the file grants white immediate pressure on black's queenside, potentially leading to a pawn majority advantage. This aggressive pawn structure, while creating potential weaknesses, also enables rapid development for the rook and exerts significant influence over the entire board. The knight's repositioning to a6, though outwardly defensive, subtly signals a desire to challenge the queenside presence and potentially exploit the now open file, aiming to activate this usually passive piece into the fray. Establishing an active bishop on this diagonal, aiming to exert pressure along the queenside files now that the queens have been exchanged, and white's queenside pawns have a different structure. Clearing the d-file for the rook and preparing to challenge white's queenside initiative by developing the bishop to a more active diagonal are the immediate goals black pursues with this bishop maneuver. Anchoring the rook to the c-file aims to wrestle for control of that open path, potentially pressuring black's queenside pawn structure and creating opportunities for future advancements. A bold maneuver, bringing the knight to the center, challenging white's pawn structure and eyeing potential outposts on c3 or d2. This piece repositions aggressively, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create active play for black's minor pieces. It's a dynamic decision, signaling black's intention to avoid passive defense and actively seek counterplay. The knight's new central placement forces white to consider its influence on the queenside and center, potentially opening up tactical lines or forcing white into positional concessions to maintain equilibrium. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this maneuver aims to create a more robust pawn chain and restrict black's knight, which is currently a bit awkwardly placed on a6. White prioritizes establishing a healthy pawn formation, preparing for potential pawn breaks later in the game while ensuring the king remains well protected. Unlocking the queenside with this exchange, black intends to exploit the newly opened files and potentially target white's isolated pawn on c3. Reclaiming the central square after the queen swap initiates a subtle rearrangement, aiming to activate the knight and potentially dominate the d-file, while also considering the advanced pawn on a3 as a future target. Reactivating the knight by aiming for a central outpost on c2, this maneuver injects new life into black's position after the initial queen trade, seeking to exploit potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure and control key squares. This maneuver injects an active knight onto a central square, challenging black's pieces and subtly preparing to exploit the open queenside files. The bishop's repositioning to c8 aims to contest the crucial central squares and potentially prepare for a queenside pawn thrust later, while also sheltering the knight that ended up on b4 and could become a target. Reclaiming the initiative on the queenside, the rook galvanizes a potential assault along the a-file, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive piece placement and pressure the isolated c-pawn. Black shores up the queenside, creating a solid pawn chain and preparing to contest the open a-file, aiming to neutralize white's central space advantage. Repositioning the bishop to f1 is a subtle yet crucial step, aiming to bolster the kingside defense while simultaneously preparing a more active deployment for this piece later, potentially supporting a central pawn push or a rook lift. The knight's retreat to b6 initiates a pawn structure shift, potentially aiming to free the c8 bishop and challenge white's queenside presence, though it does cede important central squares to white's control for the moment. Initiating a maneuvering sequence to exploit the weakened queenside pawns and create space for the knights. A strategic reshuffling occurs as black removes the knight from the d3 square, a piece that was becoming rather influential. This exchange aims to neutralize white's centralized knight and potentially open up lines for black's pieces, particularly the rook on the d-file. It signals a transition towards a more maneuvering game, where pawn structure and piece placement will be paramount, rather than immediate tactical skirmishes. Observe how this frees the e4 square for a potential future pawn advance, or a retreat for the other knight. The bishop now assumes a dominant central outpost, eyes fixed on the queenside expansion, and simultaneously prepares to support the pawn majority that's beginning to stir. Refocusing the bishop from the long diagonal to a more active role on the kingside now, preparing to contest the e4 square and potentially support a central pawn push later. Opening the c-file with this pawn capture introduces immediate tension and potential for dynamic play along that important corridor. Reclaiming central influence and solidifying the pawn structure becomes paramount after white's bold pawn thrust. Black's recapture strategically restores a degree of equilibrium by contesting the d-file and preventing white from establishing a more dominant central presence. Consolidating the rook onto the queenside, this action seeks to bolster white's queenside presence and prepare for potential pawn pushes like b4, aiming to restrict black's pieces and gain space. Reclaiming the central influence on the d-file after the exchange, this maneuver effectively establishes the rook's presence along a crucial open path, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential advancements in the center. Consolidating central influence and preparing for kingside expansion forms the core of this maneuver. The knight's retreat to f3 isn't merely a defensive repositioning. It's a subtle invitation for black to overextend or make a positional commitment, which white can then exploit. Observe how this placement opens a clear path for the g-pawn to advance, potentially creating a powerful pawn chain or even opening lines towards black's monarch if the opportunity arises. Furthermore, this frees up the e-pawn, hinting at a future e4 push to challenge black's central grip and gain vital space. The piece's re-engagement on the kingside also sets the stage for potential attacking formations and better coordination with the other pieces. Solidifying the center and preparing for future pawn advances, this maneuver anchors the e6 pawn, creating a robust defensive shield for the king side and potentially opening avenues for the f8 bishop to become active later on. Bringing the monarch to safety is paramount, a prudent repositioning that shuns any potential future skirmishes on the central ranks and clears the f1 square for potential piece development or a swift rook lift. Relocating the bishop to f8 initiates a quiet maneuver, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential advance on the king side, subtly preparing for a later kingside pawn storm or offering better defensive coverage of the king. The monarch ventures out from the relative safety of the kingside, initiating a calculated risk in hopes of activating the king as a fighting piece in the ensuing middle game, or perhaps preparing for a potential endgame transition where such a central presence becomes a significant asset. Positioning the bishop to d6 actively contests the d-file and prepares for potential exchanges, aiming to alleviate the queenside pressure white has been building. The king steps forward, seeking a more active role, potentially a sanctuary on e2, while simultaneously freeing the rook for action on the d-file. This maneuver subtly alters the pawn structure's dynamic, preparing for future pawn advances or a reshuffling of pieces to support an assault. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing for future pawn breaks represents a crucial defensive maneuver, ensuring the king's safety as the game approaches a more complex middle game phase. This exchange on the c8 square promises to unlock the position, opening a line for your rook to potentially infiltrate black's territory and putting pressure on the weakened queenside pawn structure. Exchanging rooks on the open file immediately streamlines the position, inviting an endgame where black's more advanced kingside pawn structure will become a significant asset against white's isolated d-pawn. The rook's re-entry onto the open file after the exchange aims to contest central control and prepare for a potential kingside pawn advance, potentially looking to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure around the e6 square. Securing the rook on the 7th rank now becomes a priority, potentially preparing for a future advance towards the kingside or to contest the open c-file if white commits their rook to it. Igniting central pawn activity now, white cracks open lines and creates attacking chances, daring black to react. Unlocking the king from its cage on f7 initiates a vital repositioning, aiming to activate the monarch in this tense, congested board state. Unleashing the pawn breaks open the center, forcing a reevaluation of piece placement and threatening to unravel black's somewhat passive setup. Embracing the pawn storm's inevitable clash, black's capture on e5 strategically unlocks diagonals for their bishop and clarifies central tensions, though it also concedes crucial space and potential attacking lines for white's monarch, initiating a delicate endgame dance where piece activity will supersede pawn structure. A decisive knight sacrifice clears the central files, opening diagonals and creating a powerful outpost for white's remaining knight, potentially leading to a decisive breakthrough if black isn't careful with their king's safety. Reclaiming the pawn on e5 immediately, black aims to simplify the position and remove white's central outpost, although this exchange opens up the f-file and could potentially lead to more dynamic play for white's remaining pieces around the king. Unlocking the d-file offers white a clear path to activate their rook and potentially pressure black's isolated pawn structure down the line, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares around the black king. The pawn push on g5 introduces a peculiar tension in the kingside structure, potentially weakening the kingside pawn shield further if white can exploit it with initiative. White seizes control of the open file, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses for future advances. The black king voluntarily ventures into the heart of the battleground, a bold but potentially perilous undertaking to activate the monarch and seek safer pastures on the queen's side. Seizing the open diagonal after the rook exchange, the bishop now aggressively targets black's castled king, creating immediate danger and forcing a defensive reaction that may weaken the pawn shield protecting the monarch. Preparing to contest the recently opened c-file becomes paramount, as the immediate threat to the king's safety is the most pressing concern, demanding a swift repositioning away from the dangerous diagonal. Recapturing the rook on the c-file solidifies control and prevents black's king from finding refuge on that open avenue, a vital defensive maneuver as the material thins. Shifting the bishop to b5 aims to contest the open c-file and apply pressure along the queen side, while simultaneously creating a slightly awkward outpost for the white rook on a4, forcing it to defend passively. Reclaiming the central square allows the white king to become a more active participant in the coming endgame, a crucial shift as the queens have been exchanged, and the material count is about to simplify further. Seeking to consolidate central space and prepare a potential pawn push, black repositions their monarch to a slightly more active square, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially bring them into play on the open c-file, while also keeping an eye on the compromised dark squares around white's king. Unlocking the potent diagonal for the bishop, this maneuver aims to pressure black's somewhat exposed king and potentially create weaknesses on the king side, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advancements. Trading off the bishop for the knight finally unlocks the central pawn structure and offers black the chance to redeploy their pieces with renewed purpose, aiming to exploit the slightly less defended king's side. Capturing the bishop with the king now clears a vital diagonal for white's own monarch, bringing it into a more active central role for the imminent endgame. A tactical skirmish has resolved, leaving both monarchs exposed, and this particular maneuver shores up the king's defenses against encroaching threats. Asserting kingside influence becomes paramount now, as the rook's repositioning prepares to bolster white's pawns and potentially create mating threats against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside is an ambitious, albeit risky, attempt to pry open lines for the rook and potentially harass the white king, but it comes at the cost of further weakening the pawn structure and neglecting central control, leaving the king susceptible to a swift counterattack if the initiative isn't maintained. The monarch's repositioning to the kingside opens up tactical possibilities, potentially reinforcing weak squares or creating attacking avenues, though it also leaves it slightly more exposed to potential checks along the open files. Aggressively pushing the king into the center of the board, this maneuver aims to destabilize white's pawn structure on the queen side and potentially create escape squares or even launch a counterattack, though it simultaneously exposes the monarch to potential threats from white's centralized pieces. Cracking open the kingside with f-pawn advancement looks to expose black's monarch, aiming to create tactical complications and potentially disrupt black's defense. Sacrificing the pawn opens a dangerous diagonal towards the black king, a bold decision in this tense endgame. Pushing the h-pawn initiates a race on the queen side, aiming to create a passed pawn while black's king remains somewhat exposed. Bringing the king into the fray, aiming to become an active participant in the pawn skirmishes on the queen side. The white king steps into the fray, a bold assertion of endgame ambition, ready to support its pawns and contest crucial central squares as the board simplifies. This maneuver dramatically reclaims central influence for black's monarch, bringing it into the fray and seeking to exploit the newly created dynamic by targeting white's isolated pawn. Activating the rook on the open file presents an immediate opportunity to challenge black's rook and potentially disrupt their coordination. Suddenly, the black king is exposed to a sharp cavalry charge across the open terrain, forcing a defensive scramble. The king's journey to a more secure square on g2 offers sanctuary from the immediate storm brewing on the kingside, a necessary repositioning for the monarch amidst increasing pawn pressure and potential open lines. The black king, exposed and alone, ventures into the heart of enemy territory, hoping to disrupt white's consolidated forces, a bold gamble that could lead to swift retribution. Unleashing a pawn push to gain space and create attacking potential, this move aims to dislodge black's rook and potentially open lines for white's king in the ensuing exchanges. Placing the king in this central, yet seemingly exposed, position aims to activate it dramatically for the endgame, seeking active squares to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially hunt down the isolated passed pawn on h5. a timely rook repositioning to contest the open f-file, aiming to disrupt black's king safety and potentially activate the piece for an attack down the central files. Seeking to activate the rook on the king side, this move eyes the vulnerable white king and aims to create counterplay before white consolidates further. Unleashing the rook to contest the crucial 7th rank, aiming to restrict black's initiative and create new avenues for attack. The pawns on the king side are now dangerously advanced, and the piece on d4 creates an immediate threat of infiltration, potentially opening lines towards white's king and disrupting the pawn's structure. Capturing that pawn on e6 dramatically opens the 7th rank, creating immediate threats against black's king and potentially unleashing the rook for even more decisive action. Black finally unleashes the pawn after a lengthy maneuvering phase, aiming to disrupt white's newly organized pieces and open up potential counterplay with the d-pawn's advance. The monarch's relocation to f3 now opens a dynamic avenue, potentially forcing a material exchange or creating a critical opposition scenario. Unleashing the black king into the heart of white's queenside creates a chaotic endgame where positional accuracy will be paramount. Unleashing the rook to reclaim the critical central squares, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's entrenched defense and exploit the lingering weaknesses around the king. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and this pawn is now a runaway train racing towards promotion, a final gamble to disrupt white's comfortable setup. Pushing the g-pawn here aims to create a new safe haven for the king, attempting to escape the immediate threats while also potentially opening a new attacking avenue or simplifying the pawn's structure. A queen sacrifice is on the horizon, a decisive blow to seize material and initiate a swift mating attack against the exposed monarch. Regaining the queen through a forced exchange simplifies the position dramatically, steering white towards a winning endgame where material advantage should be decisive. The king, liberated from its gilded cage, now embarks on a daring final promenade, a testament to the chaotic beauty that can unfold when all other pieces have found their ultimate purpose. The king ventures out, a bold gambit to escape its corner and engage in the final skirmish, aiming to disrupt black's immediate queen promotion plans and introduce chaos into the endgame. Unleashing a final check, black aims to disrupt white's rook's dominance, hoping to expose the king in the midst of this endgame's material imbalance. The king scurries to safety, seeking refuge from immediate threats. Sensing the king's exposure, black prioritizes activating the rook to pressure the now vulnerable central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's potential mating net and create counterplay. Shifting the king to safety is paramount. This repositioning aims to escape the discovered attack and prepare for potential pawn pushes or defensive maneuvers. Initiating a check sequence, the rook seeks to disrupt white's king safety amidst the mounting pawn crisis. Unleashing the king to hunt down those isolated pawns is a bold gamble, potentially opening up lines for both monarchs in this late-game scrum. Pushing the king into that central void, black embraces a bold, almost reckless endgame gamble, hoping to exploit the exposed monarch and perhaps conjure a mating net or a perpetual check scenario amidst the chaos. Unleashing the pawn to advance and threaten, the queen creates an immediate dynamic, forcing black to address its aggressive push or suffer a material disadvantage. Snatching that pawn is a bold, almost desperate attempt to disrupt white's impending queen promotion by creating a distraction, but it leaves black's king dangerously exposed to the relentless advance of white's 7th-ranked pawn. The promotion race is on, and this advance looks to seal the deal by creating an unstoppable passer. Black's rook now tucks itself away, seeking sanctuary on the edge of the board after a series of exchanges. The king's active participation is paramount in this critical juncture, steering towards the queenside to support the pawn's advance while also creating escape squares and potentially attacking the rook. Sacrificing the knight on b3 opens a clear path for white's king to infiltrate the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawns and potentially create a passed pawn of their own. Spotting the final promotion threat, this king maneuver clears the path for the rook to intercept and prevent an immediate queen. The king's journey to safety has ended, and the board now presents a stark contrast between white's established rook power on the 7th rank and black's lone pawn marching forward. Initiating the queen promotion signals a decisive shift, transforming the static pawn into a powerful force that will dictate the endgame's outcome. The rook's relocation now forces the queen's promotion, a predictable outcome given the pawn's unstoppable advance and the king's vulnerable position. The king, liberated from its pawn shield, now ventures into the liberated territory, a powerful force in this final act. The black pawn makes its final march towards promotion, a desperate last attempt to introduce another queen to the board against overwhelming material odds. Pushing the g-pawn now aims to break open the kingside further, seeking to exploit any defensive weakness that might have arisen from the previous exchanges, creating a potential passed pawn opportunity as the game simplifies toward its endgame. Racing to the promotion square, the pawn aims to become a queen, a decisive threat the king must urgently address. Propelling the passed pawn forward unleashes a potent threat, forcing black to react defensively and solidifying white's path to promotion. The pawn race has reached its climax on the queen side, and black's immediate promotion is a desperate but logical response to white's relentless advance. This injects a fresh burst of complications, forcing white to decide whether to immediately defend against the new queen or continue pushing their own pawn, a critical choice that will determine the game's outcome. A well-timed king advance, seizing the initiative in the endgame and probing for weaknesses to exploit. The queen's desperate flight to h8 abandons the a-file, allowing white to solidify their pawn storm's advance, which, coupled with the connected passed queenside pawns, spells insurmountable trouble for black's king. Initiating a pawn storm's final push, threatening to overwhelm black's defenses and create an unstoppable queen. Sacrificing the queen here is the only way to prolong the inevitable, a desperate attempt to create some semblance of activity against the overwhelmingly dominant advanced pawn.